Hi. If you're anything like me, you probably sometimes want to know where my shirt is. Maybe that information was mentioned in a podcast somewhere, but how are you going to find it? Are you going to personally watch all the episodes of The Integral Stage and all the adjacent meta community podcasts, hoping to stumble on the information? Don't be stupid. That's too long of time. How would you even know you're checking the right podcasts? Instead, go to the Apple App Store on the internets and get Fathom.fm. Fathom.fm is a meta podcast platform that not only figures out which podcasts you should be listening to, but which parts of those podcasts contain the answers to the questions you're interested in. Fathom.fm is making podcasts searchable, instantly chapterizable, and transcribable, and training up teams of suspiciously intelligent AIs to do the work for us. The digital universe is becoming curated by conversations and interfaced with through automated dialogue processes. So if you want to put yourself in the best position for digital synchronicity and distributed sense making this year, you may have to submit to our Robot Masters. Ask your doctor if cyborg interfacing is right for you. Fathom.fm. I do it.
Nothing like beginning a recording with a story about bloody family development. Yeah, well, there seems to be a distinction between the various ways I've shut myself off before. One of them is less, like I have to watch it because one of them can be less open to stepping into openness or criticality when it might present for someone. And then the other one is maybe really looking to energetically attune to, in some sense, always holding open that possibility and still meeting someone where they're at. But that, in some sense, you stay with family for many weeks at Christmas, and, part of that is necessary to recuperate a little bit and not over. It's one of the really challenging things, obviously, when an invitation is out there and it's not met, and maybe that's an instance of it. But
yeah, I think there's all of that, and there's another little piece that interests me, which is the kind of hygiene and respect that's involved in not trying to show everyone how open you can be.
Right.
I think when I was younger, it was more exciting to just sort of try to be fully open in interactions with people, even if they couldn't mean it, to just be there after that. But I've come to see that as a little bit lacking in some subtlety.
Yeah.
Oh, they shouldn't suffer from that gap when I could make a tiny gesture to hold more of it on my side and make it easier.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so tricky. It's so tricky trying to discern when... Because it seems like many interactions we have, particularly with family, with friends, with anyone, when there's a transformative potential and from one perspective, a sort of necessity might feel like that to the person who recognizes some malady or wound or damage. And there's a sense of, or at least something that's not quite working for the person, and you can sort of see it, and you can see that I would feel even the person might not want that pain in that way. And yet, when a healing process or a transformative process obviously has to take time, and that there's a whole contextual follow-through and embedding of whatever that process is, discerning whether I am actually available to participate in some ongoing basis, if I can take on that responsibility. Not that it's always mine in every instance. I'm not saying we can't have, even one-off encounters, but that has been something which I've been wrestling with and sort of trying different approaches about for, I would say, the last 4 to 5 years, when I started noticing I'm putting in all this effort and energy, and it seems like we're getting somewhere, and there's some beautiful experiences that happen. Or maybe I first started to notice this with my dad when I was actually quite a lot younger, because for various reasons we might have a conversation and it felt like, there's actually, maybe we're really seeing each other here for a second, and then the next day it would seem like that had never taken place, and maybe it'd be another year and a half, and then you go through those experiences like 6 or 7 times, and it's like, how do I relate to this moment now? Is this actually real, and so what is the best way to actually be in relationship to that? And yeah, I feel like we can unfold that in a way that sort of offers perspective on cultural transformation in general, and why in some sense things are so difficult to, why alternatives really are so difficult to get rolling.
There's just so many different rhythms in people, like even without damage and your human recoil pattern, things like that. I've been thinking a lot lately about the type of person who tries to integrate as many of their perspectives as possible at each step in their pondering process, versus the kind of person who likes to go all in on each step. And there's a tendency in sort of philosophical communities to dismiss that second person because they sound very partial and very imbalanced. But if you watch them, they complete a circle and arrive at their balanced perspective. There are people who are just stuck in weird circles and partial perspectives, but there's also ways where that can be someone's natural mode of sense making.
Right. Yeah, before I respond to that, Layman, could I ask you, is it possible to maybe move your mic a bit further forward? I'm losing a little bit of your...
How's that?
That's way better. Yeah. I was just losing a bit of the end of the words. Yeah, so are you noticing that developmental dynamic on a span of years? Is that the type of thing we're talking about?
No, I was thinking over shorter time periods.
Yeah.
Within the span of a single conversation or a single
conversation,
processing a topic.
Right, exactly. Like when there's some dialectical or dialogical process to go through, and that does take time to actually share many of the things, how easy it is to jump in and get stuck on a particular sense of difference, when in actual fact there was a much deeper way those things were already in a right relationship that both people would have capacity to fully acknowledge and breathe through and move on. Yeah, this is definitely something I notice a lot, and obviously it's a continued area of ongoing, because whenever, of course, I wish to speak up in a particular case of, hang on, it's like, when is that moment where one says, I disagree with that? It's a super interesting thing, and it has to come eventually, but there's these different constraints that would seem to mediate a lot of that, and then particularly with the recording button on, when you have a sense of who might be watching and what various accountabilities might be. I mean, that obviously speaks to a huge amount of the constraint set of, let's say, cultural commentary. And so how often do people even show up with enough freedom to actually listen and be with disagreement and difference for various reasons?
Yeah, that's an interesting one when you're hosting conversations, because it seems like natural to go a little bit out of your way to make space for the other person. And so sometimes I'll find myself challenging a person. I usually will wait for a certain flavor of challenge. I don't want the challenge to, be reactive or to be too assertive or too contrary. I'm looking for it to have a certain smoothness. If I find that one, then I can go into the challenge. But even then, sometimes you're talking to somebody, you push a little bit, and it's clear there's nowhere for them to go on that topic in that moment. And you're the host, and there's only a certain amount of time. So then you move on, but you think that's an interesting area because of the fact they didn't want to go there. But this is not the arena in which to do that therapy or push for another 10 minutes or something.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in what context can really enable the presencing of difference in a way that's really generative as loving, right? As appropriate, as ethical, as insightful, as creative. And recognizing the contextual elements of how that process is enabled or or disenabled, and then particularly in the context of the public. And so a lot of that has given way to the recognition of, well, at least the recognition to experiment, the effort to experiment with different membranes where access and participation is different. And there's certainly a sense, I mean, I'm curious what you think about this, because it's been a long-running thesis of mine and I've repeated it so many times. And it's an insistence on the notion that the field of those who are in attentional presence is of critical importance to the possibility for the integrity of an interaction as it approaches criticality to move in a way that is in integrity. And well, that obviously requires a lot of it's a whole intentional set, and in that sense a kind of ceremonial set and setting. And I'm committed to unfolding that over a long time. But it seems like the presence in the room, and I suppose in this case the presence of, it would be something like the shared sort of support we have for each other in our mutual imagination of what might be present, and the many different elements in ourselves that are present, which can sort of lend that. What do you think of that? Is that something that you find, because we can talk about it at an individual level, and there's various, we can talk about even technique and things at the level of complexity of understanding and which you're incredible at. I mean, I personally think that you embody a way of being with a wide plethora of people and views in a way that I've rarely seen, and certainly that hasn't come through in the way of a Layman Pascal that I've seen before. And it's sometimes curious for me to, I mean, I have an insight into it in that I can relate to what it is myself to speak to many people who, I don't even relate to disagreement in the sense of, I disagree with you. There's something else. There's I feel for the most part, barring exceptional cases, and those exceptional cases do exist, I feel very much in touch with at least what is mutually held as a desire to articulate caring, where that caring actually comes from some root that we have a shared participation in. And so in that sense, I feel in touch with the effort. And so what is the time horizon whereby we come to share in seeing or help each other see what we didn't before? I have a sense of that process and an appreciation for it. But nevertheless, it is a curious thing to watch someone like yourself, like others, maybe some particular cultural commentator who you're thinking, are they gonna, like Sam Harris is an example where Sam's basically always ready to lay down a disagreement, right? You could be the tiniest bit off point and Sam's like, well, actually, the next 3 hours is going to be about that thing, because he's got a sense of, I'm speaking on behalf of what I perceive as, like, I'm a champion of the truth of this view. And here I am in the public square. I've got to be responsive to that. And of course, that takes things in it, and people find that very interesting. Anyway, I said a few things there. But first, that piece on, like, the criticality of the integrity of a field actually enabling difference to be together. I'm curious about how you relate to that. And I suppose the other parts were just personal perceptions.
Well, I think in general, we could say there's a critical amount of sameness to hold difference at any scale of reality. But when it comes to human interactions, I think it depends on the telos, depends on what the orientation is, right? I think you can have very lively discussions where a field isn't really held very well. And you might get interesting effects. You might get magic, but you might not get the sacred, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
I think in order to get the results that are emergent, enlivening, holding multiple values together in a coherent way that favors a future that is more coherent than we can create, something that surprises us with its coherence, I think that really requires a strong commitment to individually holding a field and extending that field through a felt mutual resonance. And that if both parties are doing it, or if there's a context that amplifies that, so much better. But for me, those are my favorite types of outcomes. So I definitely put a lot of thought and concern and energy into that aspect of things. And I think when I've gone to events, when I've gone to construction situations in these meta fields, that's where it's especially dependent upon the initial conditions of what's going on for the person holding the field. Sometimes they're symbolically holding the field, but it still seems to function as though their issues and their angle that they're coming in from determine whether or not, first of all, people can land in that space. Second of all, whether they can land well enough to bring forward frictions, energies, all kinds of different flavors, and have those added to the coherence. But if your goal is to enrich coherence with things, then you need a coherence first. If that's not your goal, then there can be messier partial outcomes that are still interesting.
Totally. Yeah, well, I agree with that. I think partly my reflections on the importance of those which are gathered to enable the field, it's extremely settling and inspiring to be able to look and connect with any number of faces, stances, and recognize a sense of where they are in that relation. I think maybe it's partly the way my cognition seems to work, or a particular, I wouldn't say it's an indulgence, and I did read your Substack, which mentioned indulgence, by the way. I thought that was well written. I don't think it's necessarily an indulgence, although it definitely can be, but part of how I see the strengthening of voice is through a process of stepping into and trusting, not knowing that which is about to be said, and following that deeper thread. And it's a very scary thing to do, particularly when just beginning, or particularly when the stakes get ever more raised, and I presume they will. And the key would be to, like, as far as I'm presently seeing it, is the key would be to continue to trust, to continue to trust that. And invariably, for a moment, at least insofar as the flow of retention of many goes, it's possible to lose it. And it will definitely be lost for just that little moment where it's like, okay, now the process is to return. And that is critical for the whole thing to function anyway. That is the nature of it, is to go out and return. Divergence and convergence, all these different ways of getting at that kind of process. And then it's what is that orientation point we return to? And I suppose the degree to which that would be something integrated of enough, parts with some, again, this telic orientation, and a return to that would be a core, like chiming of the compass or something like this, and toning of the drum. And I recognize that in the kind of group situations I have been a part of and desire to continue to be a part of and create, what an incredible affordance it is when there are those who are right there who can just like offer that strength of support, because they themselves are undergoing the exact same process through that kind of listening. And that just enables the various like lack of capacity I or someone else might have in a particular moment to be supported. And then, you know, this can really open up the possibility for that real, you know, collective insight, collective intelligence. And this is one of the key things I think I continue to try and, you know, speak forth in the context of voicecraft, because I suppose it speaks to the depth of what participation is, and not just participating is not just speaking. Yeah.
Yeah, a person only has a certain amount of capacity to return on their own. Some people might be able to do it much better than others. It's a skill we can get better at folding in the natural deviations that come. But your odds of doing it more successfully and with more impact are much greater if you're doing it with teams of people. And sometimes those teams of people are not anyone you even know before. There's a certain way of being with the right kind of team that you can also use to be with strangers under certain circumstances. And you can give each other that feedback, and like you say, give each other that support. Usually the most important part of that is just to feel that you're held and that it's not broken when you deviate, that you expected to be able to find your way back in your style, in your time. And their values that. So that massively increases the odds of that.
So if it's not too much to ask as a question, how would you connect, if it feels meaningful to do so, this sort of angle in with some of the conversations or ideas you have about, you know, we could speak about religion on the one hand, we could just speak about it as coming into formation at another abstract level. I know you have conversations with John and Bruce and a number of others about the religion that's not a religion, or at least something exploring in that frame. It would seem to me that, you know, if we're speaking about return, and return that's enabled in context with others, and we are speaking about some sort of dynamic of what it would be to, you know, bind, rebind, and then when we're speaking about the sort of the individual, private, unique element of each participating in that, then as far as I've been using the language recently, we're thinking about a kind of spiritual process as in forming the capacity for the helpful formation of a kind of collective coming together. It's you mentioned the word telos before, and for as long as I can remember considering these types of questions with some, you know, continuity and real, some amount of complexity, the notion of telos has been very important. There's something about the whole dynamic of it that I haven't been able to make sense without a notion of telos. And I've sometimes used the word telos. I remember speaking with John Viveki once or twice, I think one in 2018, one in 2019. The first conversation, I used the word telos in a conversation with him, and he was quite reticent about it. He was, perhaps it's in the context I used it in, and he's wanting to be very clear that he's trying to speak about something that wasn't some eschatological, something in line with teleology as previously used in certain popular conceptions of religion. And then to clarify the next conversation we had, I tried to say, John, I kind of meant more, and I don't know if this is the right way to use the word teleology, maybe I'm using a different word, but I mean something like self-making telos in perpetuity. Something about that involvement in the process of returning to what would be then that compass, that orientation fundamentally, where that orientation is, in some sense, our deepest participation in creativity, in creation as such. I find that to be still something I've wanted to use the word telos, teleology with, and I'm curious about how you relate to that notion and how you relate to, I guess, maybe not to add, I shouldn't add too much more really, but the thing is there's something like, it seems to be the way that, if what I'm saying is somewhat coherent, the way that telos is held, is performed as an embodied sense, lived, would be very, very key to, defining. Well, it has an implication, I think, for how we think about religion that is a religion that's not a religion. I wonder if there's something that's just trying to be done with the language there that opens up a way of seeing, because I'm not really sure what I think about this religion that's not a religion. And one part of me, it's difficult to really get on board with that, with the negation of it, and still have a, because if what is proposed is a point, essentially a way of returning, well, I'm happy to see that in a sense as, well, let's just affirm that as a thing. And yet this relationship between the negation of it, so we don't end up too fixed in a particular conception, and then the affirmation as living process of the necessity of participating with ourselves and with each other in such a way that forming together is possible. I suppose it doesn't really matter, what we say. Anyway, what are you hearing what I'm saying? I'm really genuinely really curious for your thoughts here.
I'm one of those people who thinks the religion that's not a religion is another way of saying actual religion. But I also appreciate that there are different phrasings for different constituencies, and that we're going to need people from all over the logical spectrum to be involved in creating new sacred humanity. Right? So some of them come in, they've got good experiences with and a good understanding of religion or magic or shamanism or whatever it is. Some of them come in from an angle of real skepticism about that. They need to hear it a different way. So there's that sense in which we want as many doors as possible. Now, not everyone's going to come in those doors, but there should be doors for every type of discourse. I also think it's important to perform the ancient interreligious Gnostic task, right? So sometimes the religion that isn't a religion stands in for the esoteric interreligious networks that have to be able to take positions around and between religions. So they can affirm religion, but they have to be able to say, well, you can do it this way, you can do it this way, or this plant's less healthy, that plant's more healthy. And there also has to be a conjoining of, so the esoteric network, the broad openings to many types of people, and the need to deploy health and wisdom tools to lots of people very quickly, regardless of what their belief system and value system is. So all of that together is a really big project and deserves to be thought through clearly from a lot of different phraseologies. But personally, and in line with what my philosophy of what a religion is, we're just doing the thing that religion always is when it's actually functioning, just trying to generate surplus coherence within the individual and a surplus coherence between the individuals and the culture, so that they have more resonance, so they have extra energy and motive to uptake solutions and mobilize on problems that they already know about but lack the sense of camaraderie and the sense of spirit, the sense of an additional luminous, meaningful energy to motivate all. that's on the religious side. I think the phenomenology, the embodied phenomenology of telos is essential to that. And regardless of the position that people take about the ontological reality of telos, and I have a cautious ontological telos model, but that's not that important to me. What's more important is that's what it's like to work with people and work with yourself to try to build highly deep resonances. Because you're trying to get back into a certain kind of groove, that groove seems like it has a trajectory, and that trajectory has a horizon. Even if that horizon is imaginal or virtual, it shows you a certain constellation of things to move toward. And there's a sacredness and a potency in the gesture of being toward that. There's a yoga of being with telos. The other thing I would add is I typically think of the telos as like a structural, qualitative phenomenon that can take different forms. So it's not like this is the eschatological destiny of mankind. It's saying whatever good outcome we want to move toward will have certain flavors, certain configuration styles. And given where you are, if you look up ahead, you'll see your reality restructured to fit that style. But it's not reified. It's not in that actual outcome, because when you get there, there'll be a next one and a next one. But what they all have in common is sort of the qualitative architecture of the telos object itself.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. It feels to me very much how I relate to that notion. And the first part of your response was typically Shamanic Response from Layman, Pascal, I think, which is and I share that as that orientation makes sense to me. That's very close to what I mean. It's a characterization of a certain bigger picture stability I would have in interacting with the depth of ideas associated with religion in people's contexts. And it's it's curious one though. Is the religion that's not a religion, for instance, a religion only for the shamanic type in that regard? It would seem not. It would seem that would be not very plausible unless it was seen as precisely a transitionary bridge-making type dynamic. I just recognize, for instance, when I see people like Jonathan Pajot speak, and I wish I'd had a chance to speak to Paul van der Klee and Jonathan and more religious figures, really. There's a priest I met at a coffee shop the other month. I'd like to invite him along to some events, and the leader of the Hare Krishnas in Melbourne followed me on LinkedIn, which I don't think it means anything, but it might mean I can contact him or whatever, and he might be interested in coming along. And there's quite a distinctness about how I imagine many priests, many, speakers of a particular doctrine. Certainly I've met people who are followers of Gurdjieff, even, for instance, and there is whether the proposal or the offering, however power instantiated that is, often drastically, and and obviously there's historicity which has profound value, and there's all of that, and yet they're doing something that feels quite different to the role of really something that is looking to recognize some essence that's deeper than any particular set of clothing. And I am curious about moving toward those sorts of moments. This is certainly an interest I have over the months and years to come, and it's a similar attraction I have even in the context of, let's say, the culture war, although I've always really wanted to avoid getting caught in any unhelpful element of that. But it's I just wonder if you're tracking the same, like the connecting element there, which is just, I'm curious where the rubber meets the road. It is, and where influence in some sense becomes like wedded and welded into a particular way, a particular telos. And it seems like in some sense there's a similarity there between sort of choosing the hill one dies on. What is one committing oneself fully for? And one could do that from a place where it was sort of in a kind of self-knowledge, or this is not the final only way. And yet there's a profound value because this is actually what's pragmatically possible, and there's tremendous beauty, truth and goodness here, and the mystery of it is in fact still alive and indeed does touch that deeper substrate or broader potentiality as creation itself. And in that sense, when no one's, when it's just late at night and I just talk to that other fella or my partner or whatever, or just in consultation with myself, in some sense, I'm aware that what I'm doing is not for the be-all and end-all of the fixation of a particular interpretation of Christianity. But I don't think that is how most people would relate to it. And the very tension between that dynamic itself, that there are some who relate like this and some who relate like that, that is super fascinating to me. And I see a number of different proposals out there that would look to engage with that dynamic. But I'm just very, very interested in them because it seems like in that space there's so much potential for, again, the same dynamics of collapsing with too much rigidity on an appropriate way to treat it, right? And so, maybe this is where a kind of mystic's take and an analystist's take can come and be seen for some difference, because it's at that point where I feel the only way for my being in the world to step in integrity is much more of a hands back, I don't know, and yet here we are and here I am. And that would be something like, again, maybe the deep work of what would be shamanic or mystical or something like this, and will almost certainly be misperceived. And again, here is my not knowing, will you return with me, brother? Maybe not. We have to see. Is the field helping in that process? That's for those moments of criticality, that's what the stakes seem continually to be raised. And this relation between some sort of constructed narrative and the essence of what enabled some loving construction. How do we treat this dynamic? What is the ethics and integrity of this? Not in some, but in a lived sense, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to me because I'm often the skeptic about narratives, full of people suggesting we need a new narrative. So I'm cautious in that regard. I observe relation to my own narrative. It's maybe a little more distanced than some other people. What I was seeing as you were speaking, is that the phenomenon of religionization, it grows where conditions are right, and it starts to expand and complexify, and it regenerates a certain kind of patterning if it's allowed to flourish. And that pattern has something like, esoteric, mesoteric, and exoteric runs, right? So there are some people for whom meta-religion, inter-religion, religion that's not a religion, that's going to be where they naturally gravitate and where they can co-learn and co-develop skills together to hold the field and be the complex organic network of shamanic facilitators at the heart of this. And they're going to be especially good at being in and out of mystery simultaneously, being able to be dogmatic and non-dogmatic, and just extremely fluid without losing coherence. So they'll be in a kind of a heart, and around that is a whole set of communities that value that and follow it in life in different ways. Maybe they're making philosophical notes, maybe they're making new digital platforms, maybe they're artists, right? There's a whole bunch of communities there, but they will all have come in from different backgrounds. Some of those backgrounds will be classical religious traditions of various kinds. Some of those backgrounds will be people who feel like they're not religious, but they still understand they should undertake certain practices. Some of those will be fringe religions or novel religions. There needs to be space for religious generativity and a great honoring of the different major styles that people are coming in through. And these tenders, the gardeners, have to then make sure that all of those correspond as much as can be established to health and wisdom development, so that it's okay for people to exist together with a common narrative or shared mythological horizon, something that they're committed to, as long as they are in fact exercising their brain or their heart, that they're not suppressing each other, that if people feel like they want to move out of that, they can move out of that, right? Because that kind of a shell-like enclosure that tries to reinforce itself regardless of what's going on for people is a sign of ill health, as it would be in an individual organism. So as long as they're more healthy than not healthy, and as long as their reality tunnel contains wisdom cultivation practices, then they can be allowed to be part of a plurality in which nobody has to worry about anybody else's plurality necessarily until that becomes for them the way they want to see and experience things. And then they might migrate up these rungs, or they might not.
Yeah, right. Well, so the other thing that was in my mind a little bit to speak to you about, and I don't know if it's interesting. I don't know, it's actually more like, I don't know if it's too interesting, actually, that I can speak about it in a way that I'm comfortable speaking about, so that that remains interesting for people watching. Or maybe not, but we talk about health, even just health, right? We're talking about food and clean air, right? Water and medicine and all the rest of it. And now, you know, we could speak about geopolitics, and we could speak about globalization, deglobalization, fertilizer, various deficiencies, financial systems, people with guns or other types of weaponry, control of resources, food, energy, all the rest of it. And, you know, we can recognize that unless fundamental needs are met, health becomes very difficult, and particularly so being with difference, much more likely to be perceived as pure chaos when my system is in chaos. You obviously mentioned at the beginning how important it is for whoever might be hosting a particular field to be able to be in some sort of, you know, healthy coherence for that. And so then as soon as we begin to speak about health in that sense and what would be the key concrete affordances of that process, then I'm very, very curious. It becomes a very pragmatic conversation, and it becomes a kind of pragmatic conversation where the expertise for movement and progression in the effort toward enabling the possibility for a healthier world becomes one where, well, the expertise on engaging in that pragmatic game might be very much disconnected from an orientation itself to actually desire even a healthy world. You know, in many senses, they're precisely not, someone might argue. And that then becomes, it seems like a very interesting problem. I mean, maybe this is too much of a leap to then say something like, we can definitely connect them all. But when I think about institutions and universities and their power games of continuation, the revenues they need and the various policies which they undertake, whether they have shareholders or interests or whatever is going on, relationships with governments. I mean, the relationship between university and government, and this is a bit like Instagram meme conspiracy, but government as government of the mind, right? Of like some orienting control of the mind, and then you have the university as, in some sense, in principle, something which is at least open to the liberation of fixation, of truth that got caught and became less whole than it could be. We definitely see, for deep economic reasons and the continuity of the political class and orientation of often class structures and how businesses, organizations, all these things work, that has a game and a telos even. I mean, I'm just very curious how the incongruencies and often profoundly misdirected orientations of what we're speaking about, these different orientations toward enabling culture becoming together so that being can be something more worthwhile, something healthier, more loving, say, whatever we want to say. And that matters, obviously, what we say. And then it doesn't matter at the same time, right? As we've discussed, because there's something deeper. But I'm just very curious about the kind of organizing in order to genuinely account for is all too much, but at least presence and welcome into awareness as much as possible the ways what sustains us is already hooked, and what might be necessary in terms of construction in order to interact in a world so as to create the conditions for health. There's obviously a way better way to say all of that, but I feel drastic tensions here, because many of these tensions, it doesn't seem to me, could even actually be, well, all that concretely discussed in an online broadcast context. And I noticed that several of the people who I really want to speak to, yourself being one of them, to have this conversation be at least open to go for some time more than the hour we've spoken in the past we're recording. And same, I spoke to Tyson Yonkaporta, an Indigenous scholar, yesterday. He's here in Melbourne. It took us 3 years to get together. And it's only really possible. I've got to begin a lot of these relationships with people in a recorded context, which I'm happy to do. But I'm very curious about what that. I'm pretty comfortable. I'm pretty comfortable with it. But there's this necessity for a kind of abstraction as it's like it's an obfuscation, so as clarity is actually possible. Because otherwise, there's almost like a ridiculousness of opening up to speak at the concrete levels required. So these are certainly some tensions I'd like to share with you.
The way I think about it is a bit like what I was saying about telos, that there's a kind of patterning there that can fit to different circumstances. Right? There's there's an optimal exchange possible within any content. Online is one. Maybe you can't get as many dimensions and as much clarity and directness as you can get offline. But they're different spaces, and both of them you're trying to get the best resonance possible.
That's I agree with you. I agree with you. I guess whatever.
If we're planning, like if we're even imaginally constructing a sacred future for the species, then it's got to be very aware of that fact that there are going to be dramatic textual differences, right? We have to be really clear on the kind of a telos that can be undertaken in those different contexts, not worry too much about the fact that they are different contexts, because, for example, maybe the internet is still around in 10 years, or maybe something has wiped out all our electronics. Maybe the climate is holding, maybe the climate is not holding. Maybe it's a situation in which there's enough resources and respect for wisdom culture for it to flourish in the open. Maybe it's a situation where we got to go undercover, right, as has happened many times in the past. So those are all different kinds of possibilities that we should be thinking and feeling as if any number of them could occur, and we should value the skills that are transferable and can create that optimum resonance in any of those kind of reality.
Yeah, well, I agree with you, and again, I feel I hold this orientation, and it seems as though part of that orientation must be open, nevertheless, to pushing in a little bit of the way that I just did. And I sometimes wonder how it's not a comfortable pushing. It's not a comfortable pushing, because part of it suggests a bringing into criticality of the construct enabling security in any particular person's life. And yeah, I mean, really what I'm hearing you say is the core importance of accepting failure of the particular goal in any instantiated goal as absolutely necessary to actually be in service to that very thing which can create goals itself. And I get it, and I share it, and I'm often finding that orientation has not been enough to offer for many, too many, as something that nevertheless retains a call to action. And so, yeah, part of where I meet you today is, I mentioned in the email, the desire to engage in a mutual relevance realization process. I think I also scrambled the word Mr. Beast in there somewhere, the world's largest YouTuber. One of the most influential, in potential, or actual, probably in potential, beings that has ever existed. There's a profound amount of influence, and I'm very interested in the dynamics of retention. If you watch any interview with Mr. Beast, he is always focused on retention. This is a being who has trained himself to be able to nail retention throughout a YouTube clip. And he's been conforming himself to the dictates of an algorithm, which is itself conforming itself to a particular, like, possible frequency type of human activity. And so in that sense, he's an interesting mixture, because on the other hand, there seemingly is this genuine desire to do good and give people money, sort of just reinstantiating the lottery as long as you pay your ticket by subscribing and paying your attention to him. And yet that's coming from something that feels to me like a naive, good place that can, at the micro level or at the acute level, do some good. Yet almost certainly how he's managed to climb to what would be fairly enough close to the top of the attentional hierarchy is probably because a big part of him is actually deeply in a kind of congruence with the pre-established incentive structures and telos of YouTube advertisers, whatever form of capitalistic state system we have. And it's this, there's a dynamic there of maybe I'm going to bring in a bit too much stuff here, but that someone who has effectively played the game exquisitely and has an incredible opportunity to remake an aspect of it. And I just wonder how much the process of succeeding at that kind of game affords or forecloses the possibility to genuinely tap into what would be a deeper sort of transformative participation. Open questions. And yet, in the context of intelligence operatives and influence at that level, well, of course, they'll be looking at everybody with influence to influence.
Yeah, there's a classic form of wisdom influence, which takes the form of the often sinister seeming to other people, the advisor, at the right hand of the king, so to speak, that is usually part of some network of other people. And there's useless and corrupt versions of that. But in principle, the shaman can sway the chieftain and the matriarchs to some degree, right? If they exist, and if there's a social custom in which that character has status and is thought to bring something into the discussion, even if the regular power structure doesn't recognize it. Well, maybe that looks like they're whispering in the ear of tech billionaires 50 years from now. I don't know. There's a possibility of inserting that kind of influence because that's a traditional mode in which it shows up. There's also the fearsome display of the ability to mobilize people religiously. That creates some kind of influence. But we're looking at a situation now where it's really open-ended how many of the influence mechanisms will be transformed by automation, right? Like you say, there's no Mr. Beast without the algorithm that he's working with, and they're mutually conforming to each other. This seems to be the year in which publicly stratified artificial intelligence is pretty much online. There's not a day goes by when somebody isn't telling about a new interesting thing the chatbot told them, right? So it may be that a technical approach, that certain kinds of programming, that certain kinds of interfacing tools are going to take a lot of that place. And then another aspect of it is to what degree does influence capture you, right? And there's lessons to be learned that allow you to avoid problems. There's lessons that you learn by going through those problems. So there'll be people who realize that they're getting too captured. It's like Dave Chappelle walking away from his show or something like that. And there'll be people that have to go through that capture to learn a lesson. But I think if we're thinking about core wisdom communities, especially people who lean more toward the shamanic Gnostic facilitator networks, they need to be empowered as much as possible, but stay off the radar as much as possible, which is going to be right? We're never going to get right. We need to have as much influence as we can. We all need to make each other wealthier, more powerful, have more contact, have more distribution, but not so much that we look like the hammer has to come down on us if there's a sudden social stress move, or if, like you said, intelligence agencies or anyone who's interested in what's generally going on psychologically, we want them to be curious, but not think we're standing up like the guy in front of the Tiananmen Square thing, because the tanks will come and roll over you sometimes under those conditions.
Yes. So I'm split here between going two ways. One is to continue with this little thread, which is important. And the other is actually to ask you about your life and what you are finding most gripping and enlivening, and I suppose where worthwhile meets intrigue, if I'm being, particularly indulgent of my preference. So yeah, can I ask you that?
Sure. Well, where I am in life right now, there are a lot of perennial, interesting things, right? The emotional depth, the energetic interplay of private relationships, my experiences with nature, these things never seem to lose their freshness. They seem to be endlessly generative. I'm paying a lot of attention to events. This working with people around Emerge Toronto is just one example of my intrigue around a kind of a field of events of different scale, and possibly even a calendar or a kind of pilgrimage options for people to move through several of these together, to be in person and to use it as a lab to generate fields and to have all different styles, scales within a certain parameter. I'm paying a lot of attention to the need, I think, for trust and interpersonal shadow work and mutual betting and an organic mycelial growing together to happen in this field. I think one of the things that's kept change agents from accomplishing as much change as possible historically is they didn't really take the time to develop the trust and become more trustworthy with each other. And that landmines that can go off later. Paying a lot of attention to, as much as I can, because I'm not naturally a tech person, to the new platforms and the new tools, because whatever goes on there might determine everything. So I'm trying to be as educated as I can without having to put too much effort in. At least something I can do is keep the conversation circulating in those areas and try to have people share the information they have about that a little bit better with other people in the field. So there's all that, and then there's the thing that honestly takes most of my attention, which is this sense that there's an extra quality, an extra Andy, an extra form of myself that surrounds me. And when I check how I'm feeling or who I am, it's like it answers, and it's here, and it's available for dialogue, or maybe it's me, or maybe it's not me. It's extremely slippery at its edges, but it has this profoundly contented mood to it. On the one hand, it's like an eternal thumbs up, and on the other hand, it seems like it's up to something, that it sort of wants to get closer and closer, maybe even be this one, which it already kind of is, but not exactly. So that there's so much delight and mystery, and I really have fun being willfully suspicious of it, because it's the kind of thing that can easily be described in sort of heroic, traditional religious terms.
Totally.
You can make this sound like a very good state to be in, but it should survive the challenge of me saying, what do I know? Maybe you're a parasitic entity just trying to take over. Of course you would make me feel great. That's what a parasitic entity would do, to lure me in, right? So there's a lot of play for me. And when I check myself, of course I'm going to go along with this thing. It's been emerging in me for my whole life. I'm going to go farther down that pathway, but I should at least keep one ear open to playful critiques and valence flips of what it might mean, because I think our ancestors have been very poor at holding open the ranges of possibilities for their favorite experiences. And this is one of my favorite experiences.
So it seems like, so I immediately reach for archetypal language in the mode of someone influenced by Jung to language a bit of what I'm hearing there. And it's such an interesting phenomenon because there is, in effect, a profoundly natural becoming, and you're also mentioning an appropriate, playful but genuinely skeptical attitude about that as well. And there's a sense in which that there is a becoming something other that is also a profoundly becoming more of oneself. And so, one could easily see this as the becoming of an archetype of a kind. And something Peter Kingsley said, which I felt was, that's an interesting point. He was making a point critical of other Jungians who were overly critical of the notion of the reality of an inflation of an archetype that wasn't human. Not because we shouldn't have a skepticism about this, but because we should be very careful about, in the shadow, inflating the archetype of the human. And so, in a world of becoming as well as being, it just seems to be how it is. But it does seem to me that whatever does realize in us realizes with a maybe I'm thinking like I played too many video games, but it's there's other attributes that come to the fore which only make sense in a context, and which only makes sense in the context of another archetypal set. Touching something which, and I know you're not talking about this exactly, but I'm curious for your thoughts on this as well, but touching something that feels complete or desired or contented, in that sense. It seems like a beautiful duration in time, the very dwelling in which graduates a contextual shift which now situates that which was contented, complete, in a new, updated dynamic of a kind of mutuality. And again, in that sense, there is more to do. And so, I don't know if you're hearing that, makes sense, you're nodding, but it seems like that, it's awesome to hear. You certainly do share a capacity for contented relating in the different contexts of conversation I see you in, and it seems like someone, it very much seems like someone doing their thing, which is awesome. So there's that, and then the pilgrimage piece I'd love to return to as well, because this is something else, a notion I'd love to build out with you, something I share and have an interest in, and any sort of pilgrimage only makes sense if there's somewhere to go. And so this is something I'm certainly wanting to introduce in the Australian context. It's a very, very challenging thing to even approach for me, particularly as a fairly posh sounding English, was once English boy, moved to Australia when I was 11, and the sun destroys me in this land, and yet understanding and appreciating the place of this, is so important. And I think Australia has something really unique to offer in the context of pilgrimage, like profoundly unique. And so anyway, there's that piece which also, sparkles for me.
Well, we'll come back to place and pilgrimage.
Yeah.
Two things stood out to me on the previous couple of points. One is that there's no ultimate distinction between contentment and motivated agency. I think, and this is an image I got from what you were saying, maybe it's what you were saying, maybe not, but solving a level looks like contentment relative to that level, but it just graduates you to a different level. And that level seems to have, under certain circumstances, a different internal relationship, a different feeling of what the agent is like, what the motivation is like. There's a sort of curious beholding. Oh, look, it seems to be doing a lot of this, right? It's not doing things. It's definitely doing things. It has an agenda. It has a type of reality it would prefer to unfold. But the subjective quality is quite different. And the position internally that I'm, say, looking at motivation from feels different. But there's no vanishing of change and agency and attempting. Now, the issue of the critiquing people who feel that critiquing the exaggerators of archetypal independence as not noticing how much they're exaggerating the archetype of the human is really interesting. And I related it to a question a lot of people have when I teach around metamodern spirituality, which is, isn't there something you're not getting by holding this stuff in a skeptical, as if in quotes kind of position? And I appreciate the concern that they have, but I think the specific thing that makes something metamodern or actually indicates somebody's playing in the vision logic or the integrative space is that particular gap has its valence flipped, right? So it's like, there's God, and then you're like, well, there's God, right? It seems like you've reduced it in terms of its totalizing semantic and affective impact. But that's also a junction point. There's like a gate there where you can flip that and go and experience that the quotation marks are amplifiers, that they've actually brought it forth with greater profundity and agency and reality than it previously was. Previously, the quotes were implied. And then there's a dangerous gap, like Nietzsche confronting the wasteland of nihilism, but there's another side. And the other side isn't a going back. It doesn't retreat from nihilism. It becomes trans-nihilistic. And it says that very difference and those skeptical capacities are actually totally imbued and totally capable of being transfigured by the authentic reality of it. And that maybe we can get to a place that's absolute, that's even better than the absolute, right? That we need to live beyond the hyperbole, not just mediate between skepticism and ancient mythical hyperbole, but actually take the form of the skepticism as the new vehicle of access. You're muted.
Well, you won't hear the true, authentic compliment. I will just repeat that was very well spoken. So yeah. Could you? So there's this notion in metamodernism, maybe the Hansi version, and I should say that while having a real appreciation and clearly a resonance with metamodernism and even integral theory and various things, these were not pathways for me, and my knowledge of them is not great. It's quite basic. Although I feel I have a sense of knowing whenever anyone uses language from these domains to describe something, and I can relate with it very well. And it's basic in your company, obviously, and others' company may be more intermediate knowledge. But there is this notion, I think maybe in the Hansi metamodernism, I'll hear someone like Brendan Graham Dempsey refer to this as well, is the sincere irony, sincerity and irony. And this is one of the ones where, like, I heard that, I'm like, oh, I get it. Something about that, it's not quite as resonant for me. And I'm wondering whether there's a connection between that and maybe what you're articulating there, which is, because I've felt sometimes like, oh, my sincerity and my irony, they're not, I don't experience one, if I'm fully experiencing the sincerity, I'll let the irony come later, but I'm not and maybe we can make a joke, maybe that later will come moments later, because I'm a fucking idiot. But there seems, for me, there's something of the telos, in a sense, the affirmation of that process is, I relate to that as a stronger, it's more fitting for my dedication. And I'm losing a little bit of what you just spoke to, because there was some real awesome complexity to it. But this relating as an absolute which relates with an absolute beyond it in some sense, which is, maybe like a more energetically charged, complex way of speaking about the level that graduates into a new level. I wonder, if that is, I'm curious if you can connect and weave in how you would relate to the sincerity and the irony, and whether or not what you're actually saying there is in fact something that's a little bit beyond that sincerity irony type split, as an orientation for an aesthetic. You know what I mean? For the core of what's resonating the vibes, man. I don't think it's enough for me, this sincerity irony split, as often spoken about.
I think it needs to be met in order to really be appreciated. It has to be met with things that are analogous to it in multiple forms of intelligence, right? Just like if a person only had emotions and couldn't think or behave, that wouldn't be enough. That's not a slur against emotion. It just means you also need to be able to think and move around and things like that as well. So there is something really important in both and thinking and sincere irony. And to be able to appreciate what they are is essential. But you need to think it and live it and experience it in altered states and feel deeply into it and see how it plays between people and between parts of yourself. And then it starts to have a richness that is not found just in anybody who happens to mention it. The way I come at sincere irony is both of them have to be felt profoundly, and they have to not get in each other's way as the main. Right? But it's a sincerity that does not cancel out any of the irony. Likewise, the irony doesn't cancel out any of the sincerity, that they're transfigured in something. But this complementarity has what we might call different levels. Like I talk about metaphysics of adjacency, like the intercontextual space taken as if it was the nature of reality. But there's different ways to hold that. Maybe the widest way is the kind of relativistic way, where people see that there's different contexts and they move between them, but they're kind of spaced out. And then there's integrated pluralism of various kinds, where they're sort of packed together. There's like an architecture that joins them, and you embrace all of them, but you're better at going back and forth without feeling like they're canceling each other. But nonetheless, there's still something where you go into one, go into another, focus on this, focus on that. And then there's a more intense version, which I associate with non-duality, and it was sort of like non/duality, where like the opposites, the sincerity and the irony, or both and, or any two opposites are so close together that it's as true to say they're separate as it is to say they're not separate. And that's where it starts to have like different transcendental flavor that we can associate with some of the great religious mystics, right? Because to see, if I see you as you, but also I see you as the divine, there's a sincere irony, right? I'm really seeing you, but I'm also seeing something else that isn't you. And if I'm experiencing everything as what it is and also as what it isn't, or if everything is form and formless, that's very similar to sincere irony. And it can be appreciated as opposites, or as relative complements, or as integrated complements, or as something that almost completely undoes the sameness and difference of it in a way that's transfigured.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you for that. So maybe there's in part of what I'm translating, trying to understand, there's a sort of depth of participation as affirmation of what would be the invitation to the language of sincerity, and sincere irony obviously has an embodiment. That there's a depth of participation to that, which can be held, such as it's much more deeply the thing. And then there's, maybe one can witness potential artistic representations or other, manifestations of what proclaims sincerity and irony, which are in fact not real, not as true, not like a much more disconnected in the participation of one. Like one seems like so what I'm hearing is the sincerity is not to negate the irony, and the irony is not to negate the sincerity. One's irony shouldn't kind of profane the sincerity, and the sincerity shouldn't in some sense like maybe profane itself by being unable to recognize the qualities of the irony as you begin to beam up into somewhere else, maybe where you're from. Yeah, I think there is a, as I say, I appreciate it. I think there's a value in it, and I appreciate the sincere irony. I've just noticed, I have noticed in my years sometimes the ironic aspect can be weaponized, would be too strong, but there's something very attractive. I mean, it's like the trickster, or like the dark jester who never leaves the circus before returning. I've met some of those on the way, and I know that, and that thing is that's an intoxicating presence for many, and it's probably a lot more fun than the sincere version. Yeah, probably retention's a lot better on the old algorithm, but it's it would be an interesting one for the aesthetic movement of things. I don't know. I am definitely going to reflect on and try and participate deeply with what you had to offer about that. So thank you.
In some ways, it's very contemporary, very emergent to want to endorse a form of basic cognition that goes along with Windows, goes along with quantum ambiguity, goes along with a lot of the advanced philosophical thinking of the last 50 years, that we want our humanity, we want our spirituality to be able to operate at that level of strange interfaces and loops and uncertainties and fuzziness, because our experts in the rest of the world who look deeply into reality are saying that's what reality is like. We've got to become a little less concrete about hope in order to be more accurate about this. So it's lovely, and it's a project of this historical moment to try and see what kind of a dharma you can generate using those sorts of concepts. But at the same time, it's like anything else. If you have a flag that says sincere irony, it's like having a flag with Jesus on it or Buddha. That some of the people holding that flag will be at the deepest saints you can imagine, and some will be superficial believers, and some will be cynical believers, and some are there because of some weird mythology. There's going to be all kinds of different ways of holding anything, including sincere irony and metamodernism, neutral, and all the rest.
Yeah. Well, I am. So now I'm wondering how much longer that you would like to speak for, and there's a number of things that I would love to talk to you about. One that's very present for me would probably take quite a while to unfold, and so it's probably worth holding on to. So I'm in this point where maybe there's this part about the pilgrimage type stuff as well. But there's part of me that's feeling a desire to sort of bring things to a close, because otherwise I'm gonna open things in a big way.
No, I appreciate that, and I want to have that conversation with you. That we should give it the space that it needs. This is already very, very unlike an interview. We just started talking, and we've covered a lot of fascinating things, and there'll be some links about your stuff when this goes up. But this has been a very, very lovely, very charged, very intelligently heartful conversation, in my experience. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. It's awesome to speak with you for a length of time that really allows taking the time to unfold and give and receive. Oh, that Friends episode, like they got it so right. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, thank you, mate.